Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Glenn Woodbury. In this thesis series, we are talking with Kevin Starbuck, the Assistant City Manager in Amarillo, Texas. Welcome, Kevin.
Welcome, thank you.
Your thesis is entitled Moral Hazard, How the National Flood Insurance Program is Limiting Risk Reduction. Where did the idea for this research come from?
Well, Glenn, it certainly started off in some of the early research I did as part of the NPS program, in that this concept of moral hazard certainly rose to the top, and I was discovering that more and more in the disaster research used as an assumed concept that existed in disaster recovery programs that were provided by government. So from that, it kind of became an opportunity to explore an issue, something that in 20 years of working in emergency management, I was unfamiliar with.
Okay, so moral hazard, I mean, it's kind of a strong, provocative term. What do you mean by moral hazard? Well, and who do you apply it to?
Exactly, and moral hazard, the roots of it comes from insurance and economics and public policy. And from that, it basically describes when somebody doesn't assume the full risk or the full responsibility for a decision, then they won't make a moral or a responsible choice with those decisions. And from that, when government intercedes, how does that affect how people react to things? Does that affect their ability to limit the risk that they are willing to assume?
Okay, so sometimes you think moral hazard applies to the individual, and they're taking a moral risk by not preparing for whatever reason, but isn't moral hazard also applied to policymakers? And do you look at both sides of that coin?
And certainly I think that's what my research showed, is that while moral hazard can exist with the individual and decisions that they make based on government programs and the benefits that are provided by those government programs, it also exists at the policymaker level, where they formulate programs that don't allow for the administrators of those programs to reduce risk in a more effective way.
Okay. Did you see moral hazard in that concept kind of playing out in your past, in your experiences?
I think what I saw was that certainly in recent times, what I saw is that people who had lived in properties for a number of years and were maybe at the edge of a floodplain or were within a floodplain didn't recognize that hazard existed for them, and then when a flood occurred and impacted them, they acted as if this hazard shouldn't have affected me. This was caused by some other entity causing issue that changed the way the flooding impacted my property. So from that perspective, it was a matter of passing the blame, so to speak, to others and to development in the area or to just Mother Nature in general. And it became a question of how do we formulate policies to address that more effectively? How do we formulate policies to address their lack of perception of what the real risk was?
And do you think policymakers have this concept of moral hazard as well, that they see through their policies that they're either creating or minimizing moral hazard, especially in, obviously, emergencies and disasters?
I think we certainly saw that in the 2004, 5, 8, and 12, when we had the major hurricane seasons that just caused devastation and really put the National Flood Insurance Program in a real physical danger spot, in that it was not able to support itself. That it was at that point that policymakers, I think, started to see the light and started to recognize that some of the policies that we put in place for subsidies and funding repetitive loss created this opportunity for people not to change their behavior and not to limit the risks that they were willing to take. Through that, they took steps to address that through changes in policies. Yet 2 years later, that resolve was broken down by public outcry over the expense that was applied to that, and those policies were reversed.
Yeah. Well, one might claim that moral hazard can present itself in many hazards, whether it's earthquakes, severe storms, winter storms. You chose flooding as kind of the hazard that you illuminated or that you used as your I guess your method for talking about moral hazard. Why did you choose flooding?
Well, first of all, the National Flood Insurance Program is one that has been on the Government Accountability Office high-risk series for over 10 years now, starting with the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So that became a very clear example of a program that had physical issues stemming from policies that were put into place that maybe didn't set it up for dealing with catastrophic events. In addition, flooding is the most prominent hazard in the United States. The statistics just play out that 78% of all major disaster declarations involve flooding in some way, shape, or form. It is clearly the most significant hazard as far as costs and claims that the federal government gets involved with and works through. So when you look at it from that perspective, it became maybe the most obvious choice to explore this issue of does moral hazard exist when government intervention is in place.
Okay. So as you brought up, the cost of water-induced disasters or water-related disasters are, kind of the top of what we look at as the costliest disasters. So if we reduce those types of disasters, then those put the biggest dent in the overall budget cost, whether it's the federal, state, or local or private level. Why is it so hard? I mean, if that's kind of the big, low-hanging fruit that we can reduce water-related disasters, why can't we do that? Why would removing a moral hazard type of argument or justification help reduce those costs, or would we be still remain with those costs regardless?
I think what I found in doing the research was that subsidies and the funding of repetitive loss were components that were built into the program from the get-go. When the program was formulated in the 1960s, the late 1960s, those were pieces that were put into place, not so much to create unintended incentives for the program, but they were incentives that were put into place to get people to participate in the program and to take advantage of what the government was trying to do to address this really big issue in the form of flooding. So as those things were put into place, the idea was that over time they would be able to be phased out, and we could remove those incentives that were put into place to get people to take advantage of the program. Unfortunately, what we have found is that there wasn't a clear mechanism to remove those incentives. And what we have found is that things like subsidies that they thought would be phased out over a 15 or 20-year period now probably won't be completely phased out until the mid-2000s, the 2050 timeframe. So when you look at that, it's become a much more systemic and much more longer-term issue within the program that will literally exist for almost 100 years within the existence of the program, without that incentive being pulled out. And part of the challenge is when you have those types of incentives, it reduces the motivation to do mitigation. If you were to take some sort of mitigative action to reduce your flood risk, you're assuming that you will recover those costs over a more extended time frame, a 10 or 15 or 20-year time frame. Well, if you're paying a subsidized rate today of 40 or 45% of a full risk rate, that change in your hazard from a mitigation perspective, you won't recover those costs for 10 or 15 years. And if you're already paying that lower rate, there's really no incentive to mitigate those hazards. So you're having to identify new and different mechanisms to do those things. Bigger Waters that was passed in 2012 attempted to do some of those things, attempted to phase out subsidies and repetitive loss over a 4 or 5 year period. Unfortunately, what they had was the public outcry of, my bill is going up so rapidly, I can no longer afford it, my property value is impacted by it, and you basically have made it to where it directly impacts me economically, really created a challenge that the policymakers didn't foresee or didn't address effectively.
So you almost use the terms incentives and entitlements interchangeably. I mean, not quite, but certainly overlapping. So when do incentives, whether that's for the individual or for a government to do mitigation as an example, when does that shift into entitlements, and how does that change the dynamic?
Well, I think incentives certainly have a place in the policymaking environment. The use of incentives to get people to participate in a program, to take advantage of a program, create that mechanism to bolster the program, build it up, get people involved, and to let them take advantage of that. It's always that catch-22 or that danger point of at what point does it become an entitlement, and it's important that policymakers phase in or create mechanisms to reduce those incentives over time and bring things back to a full risk rate. And I think that's certainly what the National Flood Insurance Program experienced was, while the policymakers initially felt that over a 10 or 15 year period, those issues of subsidies could be phased out, the reality is that those incentives never went away. And while it has been reduced from initially 80% of properties received an incentive, today only 20% of policies receive an incentive, even with that reduction, it's still a very substantial amount of properties that are receiving those subsidies. And it creates that mechanism of how do we get ourselves out of that mode of incentivizing high-risk properties.
What did you know about the National Flood Insurance Program before you started your research?
I was a little bit familiar with it, but certainly it was not a program that I was in depth in my knowledge of. So it certainly provided through the program an opportunity to explore that program, to learn about the program. And I think the reason that program spoke to me more than some of the other disaster assistance programs was because of it being considered a program that was at high risk, or the one that was in financial trouble from a fiscal perspective, and how do you address those types of issues with a program like that? So through the research, it very quickly came to light of different aspects of the program that were contributing to limits and risk reduction, things like repetitive loss funding, things like subsidies. And then from a more global perspective, started to look at how these catastrophic events were impacting the program and were causing massive costs on the program, and how the program has been formulated to deal with a normal year versus a catastrophic year, created those mechanisms where the program didn't have the resiliency to sustain itself for a long period of time.
Did you have any surprises or aha moments during your research?
I think the biggest aha moment, so to speak, was when I started to look at the research and identified some studies that had been done by FEMA and by the Homeland Security Department, was looking at what is the National Flood Insurance Program going to have to deal with into the future. Things like the issues of climate change and how that is going to change the dynamic of flooding. One study in particular was talking that by 2100, there is not a point or a location in the United States that won't experience an increase in flood hazard than we have today. So you already have a program that is weak in dealing with catastrophic issues and funding catastrophic flood events, that is now going to be faced with an increasing impact from climate change and more flooding in communities across the country. So how do we start to address that today to start to correct those issues for the future?
Okay, and what are your recommendations? What did you find from your research to turn into potential policy recommendations?
I think the biggest thing that came out of my research was the importance of addressing those issues now. Things like addressing how do we phase out subsidies for good? How do we address how to more effectively recover repetitive lost properties and turn those into properties that we're not recovering on a regular basis? And how to apply mitigation across the board more effectively. The fact is that we're going to continue to have flood events. Flooding is going to continue to be one of those high-risk activities or high-risk events that the federal government and government in general will have to step in and assist with. So how do we start addressing that today to set us up better for the future?
Yeah. Isn't much of this about communications, though? I mean, you're trying to, in some ways, convince people to move out of flood-prone areas, to not build there and therefore not stay there after a flooding occurs. That's more of a communications discussion, isn't it, with policymakers, than it is a kind of a cut and dry. This is, kind of the phases that we will stop these programs, stop these entitlements, or stop these incentives. Was there any communications type of analysis in your thesis?
Not specifically. Not specifically on the communications side of it. But once again, I think what we found was that when policymakers went in and tried to remove subsidies or remove incentives that were plaguing the program and causing issues within the program, a very poor job was done in communicating those issues and why those issues were important. Hence the backlash that came from the policyholders to the policymakers saying, you can't do this to us. You're putting us in a compromised position to be able to afford the coverage that you so importantly want to provide us. So the question then becomes, how do we better set ourselves up for success with those types of things? Phasing out subsidies over an extended period of time, doing it over a 10 or 15 year period of time versus trying to do it over a 4 to 5 year period of time probably would have addressed some of those issues. And certainly some of other researchers have brought that up as a more viable approach.
Some of the approach, and obviously one approach is not allowing people to build in flood-prone areas to start with. Therefore, you're not increasing kind of the risk by having more and more people move into those areas. That's of course challenged by increasing flood events, right? So maybe it doesn't matter that you're stopping in this area if it's increasing in other areas. The other dynamic is people leaving. Whether that's dying, selling their homes, or whatever it is, leaving those flood-prone areas. What is the rate of that, and is that another potential policy area to talk about?
I think the biggest thing that came out on that front was the lack of comprehensive evaluation of how states and local jurisdictions were implementing floodplain management. Number of different sources cited that was a weak area within the federal program, and how do we better address those types of issues to ensure that floodplain management is being effectively implemented and we're doing good planning policies on community development. to avoid development in flood-prone areas and to avoid increasing risk in the future. So much of it is predicated on a flood insurance rate map being developed for a community.
Right.
And when those changes occur, when climate change starts to increase the risk, how do we more effectively and more rapidly communicate that and adjust the development policies in those jurisdictions? Those are issues that have to be addressed at the local level and work their way up. Because the federal government doesn't have those responsibilities to do those community development type activities. So it really creates that need for a strong partnership at all levels of government to ensure that we're not increasing risk in general.
Okay. Did you think about how the idea of moral hazard applies to other threats and risks as well, whether as you're writing this or as you explore the idea?
Certainly, that was kind of the next step in the research. Is we explored it in a case study of the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, how might that apply to other government disaster assistance programs? One of maybe the more clear examples of an area that would be worthy of future research is public assistance under the Stafford Act, where if a jurisdiction qualifies for a federal major disaster declaration, 75% of the costs are transferred from the local jurisdiction and the state jurisdiction to the federal government. And certainly there are some things that are trying to be put into place, such as disaster deductibles, to start to address those types of issues. So I think that is an area certainly worthy of future research using some of the same case study methodologies that I applied to the National Flood Insurance Program.
Okay. Well, you're the assistant city manager of your jurisdiction. How do you see your research and your findings applying to your jurisdiction, but also to similar jurisdictions across the country? Well, how do you see
Sure.
actually in action?
I think one of the things that we need to do a better job of is while I oversee departments like community development, applying some of these concepts of, are we creating a hazard by allowing development in an area? An area that may be low-lying or in a floodplain may be cheaper property, but is it the right decision to create a mechanism where somebody develops in those areas? And certainly our floodplain management programs try to address those types of issues, but it's important that as a policy level decisions that we try to put those things in place. More globally, certainly as an emergency management and public administration leader in our community, it's important that we apply those same concepts on a state level and a regional level and beyond. The state of Texas is one that is right at the top of the list for flood issues and flood impacts. So it's important that while those issues may not be as prominent in my jurisdiction, that we communicate that at a state level and a regional level so that those things can be addressed in a more thought-provoking or thoughtful process on a state level, because it's right at the area where these types of issues occur.
Great. So a broader question, do you think the overall master's program better enabled you to do your job into the future?
Absolutely. I think the way the master's program is geared is it does give you a broad spectrum of topics related to Homeland Security and exposure to those topics and exploring those topics. While I chose to go down the path with my thesis of looking at something that was emergency management related, which tied to my position with the city at the time I was in the program, the application of the concepts, the critical thought processes, the how do we address these big issues is one that can be applied in any position within a local government, a state government, or beyond.
Well, thanks very much, Kevin. It was an honor to be your advisor, and congratulations on your research.
I sincerely appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be in the program.
All right, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.